This is the Skoda Kushaq. It's the first model that the company has specifically designed for the Indian market. It's engineered here, it's built here, and it's part of the India 2.0 program that is being rolled out across the region here. I'm going to have a little bit of a look at it and show you through some of the features on it, because this is an equivalent in terms of size and performance to the Skoda Kushaq that we have in Europe, but there are some interesting differences, so let's take a look. Now, the overall design is that usual chunky SUV look that we're used to seeing, and it is quite a familiar design in comparison to some of the models that we have in Europe. So you have this big chunky grille here in the front, and this particular version is the Monte Carlo spec. So this grille surround is in gloss black. You also have gloss black finish here and on these trims around the bumper. But in other standard Kushaq models, a lot of these are chrome, and although it's maybe not quite to European tastes, here in India, that's an important thing to have. There are a couple of other details you'll see. Full LED headlights here. It follows the same split design that we see in Skoda's other SUVs. And then around the side, again, you've got that chunky, hard-wearing plastic here and a Monte Carlo badge. Again, chunky alloy wheels, contrasting black door mirrors, and black roof rails, all the kind of things that we're used to seeing on Monte Carlo models. Now, the Kushaq is built on the MQB A0iN platform. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's effectively a specifically designed platform for this market, though it is based on the MQB A0, which underpins a lot of other models that we have in Europe. It's got a nice high roof line here and a lot of ground clearance, because that's quite an important thing in this market, because there's A, the roads aren't always in great condition, and B, in some of the bigger cities, there are enormous speed humps to have to climb over. So these things do actually become quite practical. And at the rear, you've got the usual Skoda design that we're used to seeing. Crystalline LED tail lights here. You've got some reflectors and a black strip across the back. On other models, this is a chrome feature. You've got the name spelled out across the back. And of course, being a Skoda means you're going to have a lot of practical boot space in here too. You can also drop down the rear seats. They have a 60-40 split. All pretty good. On the interior, there are some new features that we don't normally see in this type of class. For example, ventilated seats are a standard feature on this model. It's very important here in this warmer climate that you can keep cool. On the inside, well, you've got a similar design that we've seen in other models. So you have this kind of winged look here on the dashboard. There's a 10-inch display as standard. This uses a slightly different infotainment system that we normally see in Europe. Skoda has its own app Play Store. It's also got wireless Android Auto and Apple CarPlay. You have a wireless charger in here in the center console and two USB-C charge ports, as well as a 12-volt socket. So all of your charging needs are well catered for in this car. This has the 7-speed DSG automatic transmission. You get a manual handbrake, and you get a fairly familiar look in front of the driving seat as well. The steering wheel is a multifunction affair. It's a 2-spoke design, like what we see in models like the Octavia back at home. In front of you, there's an 8-inch digital display, and gives you all the sort of usual driving features that you'd need to know. Everything is very clearly laid out, and it has a very familiar look to it. I mentioned that this car is designed specifically for the Indian market, and one feature that was shown to me, which I had never seen before or perhaps understood, was that it has an indemnity recess here on top of the dashboard, and that allows owners to place their specific idol on the car. And rear space is important in a car like this, and there is quite a lot of it. I'm sitting behind my normal driving position. I'm 5'8", and I've got plenty of leg room here. I've also got reasonably good amounts of headroom as well. Other things apart from space is practicality. You've got deep door bins, you've got electric rear windows here, but it's also a very safe thing for rear passengers. The Kushaq was the first car to score a full 5-mark score in both front and rear seat occupancy protection. Makes the car quite important, and here in India, car safety is becoming a really important feature that a lot of customers are looking for. And in fact, India's legislators are pushing for much more stringent safety regulations. And this car, for example, is equipped with 6 airbags, something that is about to become a standard feature from next year in India. The Kushaq might have been designed specifically for the Indian market, but don't think it's a million miles away from the sort of quality of car that we get in Europe. There's a lot of positive things from driving this Kushaq for the first time here in India. First of all, there's the engine. This particular one has a 1.5 litre 4-cylinder petrol engine. It's mated to a 7-speed DSG transmission. It's effectively the exact same as what we'll get back in Europe in cars like the Fabia. So all that works very well. It has stop-start system and it also has cylinder deactivation. So as you're cruising along on part throttle, it can shut off 2 of its 4 cylinders to reduce fuel consumption. All good things. But the platform also has been designed to be that bit safer. This is the first car that has received 5-star rating for both passenger and child occupancy in the global NCAP crash tests. That's a pretty big deal, especially for a car sold in this market where safety hasn't always been at the forefront of manufacturers' minds. That is changing here in India though, because now India is actually ahead of Europe in terms of what it's doing to bring in and improve safety legislation. It will be one of the first markets in the world to make 6 airbags a compulsory thing on new cars sold. All positives. But what's it like to drive? Well, the roads here in India will show up any car's shortcomings when it comes to suspension and chassis setup. And the Kushaq does a pretty good job of soaking up some of the worst that gets thrown at it. We've been on some pretty bad roads. In fact, we've been on some sections of road that you couldn't really call a road, that have been washed away, that's effectively a dirt track or even just like heavy gravel. And it does it all very, very well. The suspension setup manages everything quite nicely, and the only thing I'd really say is I'd like if the damping was a little bit better. On the smoother tarmac though, it's fine. It cruises along quite comfortably and there's not even a huge amount of road noise coming in. Okay, it's maybe not quite as quiet as what we're used to on some of the European models, but the difference, as I mentioned, isn't all that big. You don't have engine modes, but you do have a sport mode in the transmission, and basically does the usual thing of when you engage it in a DSG back in Europe, you can also use the paddles, and when you exceed 80 kilometers an hour, over here you get a warning. The driving position itself is quite good and there's plenty of adjustment, pretty good visibility too. I can see all the way at the back as well. There's no big pillars obstructing my view, and pretty good side mirrors. The combination of the Kushaq's weight and that 150 horsepower means that it does feel quite brisk, even if speed might not be the most important priority in this part of the world. After all, you won't find any unrestricted autobahns around Mumbai. The assisted steering is a little bit on the light side, but that's not really anything that's very uncommon in this segment of the market. The steering wheel itself is the same sort of design as what we get in the Octavia and things like the Enyaq, although the actual quality of the wheel itself isn't quite up to the same standards as what we get in Europe. And this car has just over 3,000 kilometers on it, and it's already just a little bit shiny and just feels a little bit on the cheap side. But again, one other thing to consider is that in this part of the world, the climate is very, very different. Materials have to be done slightly differently to cope with the more extreme heat, more extreme humidity. So we don't necessarily get the exact same quality or the same materials as we are used to seeing on European cars. The Kushaq also scored quite well in the newly introduced front-side pole test element of the global NCAP test. But besides the airbags and the crash tests, one of the other safety and assistance systems that the Kushaq has is a brake wiping function. What that does is when the rain sensors activate, part of the automatic wipers, when it starts raining, it will apply a little bit more brake pressure to the calipers, which pushes out the pads and keeps them in contact with the discs. It effectively wipes them dry and ensures that they're always ready to deliver the maximum possible braking performance. That's quite important in a region like this where you have heavy downpours, especially in the monsoon season, and it just means that the car is always at its best ability to stop in a hurry when it needs to, and that is something you will need to do here. I imagine that brake pad sales are probably quite strong here in India when you drive in the traffic, because there's a lot of very quick, very sudden braking moments. No matter how much attention you think you're paying, other road users will just pull out in front of you, randomly stop without warning. So you always have to be absolutely on your toes when you're driving here. It's quite an experience, and it's very different to driving in Europe. The Kushaq has been designed specifically for the Indian market, and it taps into a growing demand for crossovers here. Part of that is the fact that this has pretty decent ground clearance, something that Indian customers frequently look for, because in some of the bigger cities, speed humps are pretty serious, and if you go into any dealership, it's one of the first things you'll notice is customers looking to see how much ground clearance there is. The suspension is also pretty good, considering just how poor some of the road surfaces can be in certain places here. So it does soak up everything quite well, and also it doesn't come to the detriment of how this car handles. Okay, granted, we haven't been driving on any particularly challenging or demanding roads, but other than maybe some slight refinement in suspension and a little bit more sound insulation, this car is every bit as good as something that could be sold in Europe.